In March 1983, a dust storm buried Beijing under 43,000 tons of toxic sand in a single day. The sky turned blood red. Emergency respiratory calls spiked 300% overnight. Computer models delivered a verdict with no appeal by 2050. One of Earth's great megacities would be uninhabitable. So humanity launched the largest engineering counterattack in history. 2 decades of concrete, machinery, and controlled planning. And it failed? Then in 2003, geological satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above the Gobi picked up something no algorithm had predicted. Massive green blooms erupting spontaneously across the driest core of Central Asia. No irrigation systems, no construction crews. The exact coordinates where China's engineers had just declared total defeat. To find the answer, investigators had to unseal a classified file from 1986. The year a military cargo plane quietly dropped 11 zoo animals into the heart of a dying desert and flew away. But here's the part that nobody in the government wanted to admit out loud. The $47 billion they had already spent wasn't saving the desert. It was killing it faster. In 1978, China launched the Green Great Wall, the largest reforestation campaign in human history. The plan was straightforward on paper. Plant 66 billion trees in a barrier stretching 4,500 kilometers, a wall of wood standing between Beijing and the advancing Gobi. The trees went in. Neat rows, uniform spacing, military precision. Engineers photographed them from helicopters and called it progress. Then the water bills came due. Industrial tree plantations in arid zones are thirsty in a way that deserts simply cannot afford. The root systems of those billions of planted poplars and elms began pulling moisture from aquifers that had been stable for centuries. Water tables across the region dropped 12 meters in under a decade. The trees weren't fighting the desert, they were drinking it dry. Villages that had farmed the same wells for generations woke up to find nothing but dust 40 feet down. Entire communities were relocated. The trees themselves began dying from the roots upward, which is the botanical equivalent of a structure collapsing from the foundation. By 1985, agricultural productivity across Xinjiang province had collapsed by 34%. But the deeper problem wasn't the trees. It was what the absence of large grazing animals had done to the ground itself over the previous 16 years. Without hooves continuously breaking up the desert surface, something engineers had no term for was quietly spreading across the landscape. Scientists would later call it biological concrete, a hardened crust, sometimes just 2 millimeters thick, that formed across the topsoil like a seal. 2 millimeters sounds like nothing, but those 2 millimeters were a death sentence. When rain fell, the rare, precious rain that does fall, even in the Gobi, it hit that crust and bounced. It could not penetrate. It sat on the surface for a few hours, then evaporated completely under the heat. Not one drop reached the root zone. The soil beneath had effectively become clinically dead. Not dry soil, not poor soil, biologically inert material, the kind of thing you'd find on the moon. Not on a continent that once supported millions of migratory animals. The $47 billion of human engineering hadn't solved that problem. It had walked right past it. Because the engineers were looking at the desert the way mechanics look at a broken engine, find the faulty part, replace it, restore function. More trees, more irrigation pipes, more soil supplements poured from trucks. What they couldn't see, because no engineering diagram accounts for it, was that the desert wasn't missing infrastructure. It was missing a trigger. That same year, in a conference room in Beijing, a researcher named Yang Jianming set a tray of dead soil on the table in front of a room full of engineers and government officials. Around him were stacks of reports, irrigation blueprints, reforestation targets, proposals for deeper pumping systems, stronger barriers, and more machinery. He pushed all of it aside. What he proposed instead stopped the room cold, stopped the tractors, stopped the tree nurseries, bring back the Przewalski's horse. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was the kind of silence that happens when someone says something so far outside the bounds of reasonable thinking that the room doesn't know whether to argue or simply move on. Because here was the problem. The Przewalski's horse hadn't existed in the wild since 1969. Not endangered, not critically rare. Gone, functionally extinct in its native habitat for 16 years. And what remained wasn't exactly a strong genetic foundation to build from. The entire global population at that point numbered around 900 individuals scattered across zoo enclosures in Munich, Prague, and a handful of facilities in the United States. But the real number, the number that mattered, was far smaller. Due to a severe population bottleneck that followed the destruction of Central Asian ecosystems during and after World War II, only 9 of those 900 animals carried viable reproductive genetics. The entire species had been squeezed through a needle. Yong Jianming was proposing to take animals from that fragile, inbred, zoo-raised population creatures that had never touched wild ground, whose parents had never touched wild ground, whose grandparents had never touched wild ground, and release them into one of the most hostile desert environments on the planet. The international scientific community did not respond with curiosity. Nature magazine, one of the most respected scientific journals on Earth, published a piece characterizing the proposal as throwing money into dead soil. The language wasn't diplomatic. These were the world's leading ecologists, and their collective verdict was that the project had no scientific basis for optimism. A BBC documentary crew flew in to cover the release. They lasted 48 hours on the ground before packing their equipment and leaving. Their assessment, delivered without hesitation, was that they were watching a government waste millions of dollars in real time on a project with no realistic chance of success. Not one of the 11 animals selected for the first release was expected to survive the first winter. The odds weren't against this experiment. The odds had looked at this experiment, done the math, and walked away. And yet the cargo plane was already loaded. What nobody asked, what nobody thought to ask, was why the machines had failed in the first place. China had sent in tractors, industrial plows, steel-tipped ripping equipment designed to break compacted earth. The logic seemed obvious: if the crust is too hard for water to penetrate, break the crust. But here's what happened instead. A standard agricultural tractor weighs somewhere between 5 and 10 tons. That weight distributes across wide rubber tires or steel tracks, and that distribution is the problem. The pressure spreads out, which means it pushes down evenly across a broad surface. It compresses the deep subsoil layers without breaking the biological crust on top in any meaningful way. The machine rolls over the problem, flattens what's underneath, and leaves the surface seal largely intact. The engineers weren't breaking the desert, they were packing it tighter. Now consider what a Przewalski's horse actually does to the same surface. An adult individual weighs between 600 and 800 pounds. That weight concentrates down through 4 legs into 4 hooves, each roughly the size of a human palm. When the animal moves at speed, the impact force at each hoof strike reaches up to 800 psi pounds per square inch. That's a number comparable to an industrial jackhammer making contact with the ground. But unlike a jackhammer, the hoof doesn't shatter the microbial structure beneath the surface, the angle of impact. The brief duration of contact is the slight give in the hoof wall. These are mechanical properties refined across 40,000 years of evolution on exactly this type of terrain. The crust breaks, the soil beneath stays alive. That's the first mechanism. The second one is harder to see. And it took researchers years to understand what they were looking at. Engineers plan in rows, straight lines, uniform spacing, maximum coverage per unit of labor. It makes perfect sense on paper. But uniformity in a desert is a trap. A monoculture of spacing creates a monoculture of conditions: same depth, a same exposure, same drainage pattern. Nothing diverse survives in it. Horses don't move in straight lines. They follow scent, water gradients, temperature shifts, social hierarchies. Their daily range covers roughly 15 kilometers, and the path changes every single day, mapped from above. And the track of a single herd over a season looks less like a road and more like interference patterns on a pond overlapping arcs. Tight clusters near water, wide loops across elevated ground. What this randomness produces on the desert floor is something no engineer would think to design. Every hoof strike that breaks the biological crust creates a small depression, a micro basin. When rain falls, and in the Gobi it falls rarely and hard, those depressions catch water before it can sheet off the sealed surface and evaporate. Each one holds moisture just long enough for something to germinate. Multiply that by a herd moving daily across thousands of hectares, and the result is a patchwork landscape. Short grass here, tall grass there, bare mineral soil in between, shrub seedlings in the depressions with the most retained moisture. Ecologists call this a mosaic structure. It's the single most productive configuration for supporting insect diversity, which supports bird populations, which drives the next level of the food chain upward. No tractor can produce a mosaic. A tractor can only produce rows. Stop engineering. Start remembering. The horses were not a conservation gesture. They were a 40,000-year-old soil restoration technology that humanity had switched off and had spent $47 billion failing to replace. The first winter at the Jimsar Acclimatization Center was supposed to be managed, supervised, controlled. It wasn't. Temperatures dropped to negative 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The horses 4 generations removed from any wild environment, born and raised inside the climate-controlled enclosures of European zoos, were now standing in open desert with no shelter and no feeding schedule. And then the botfly infestation hit. The parasitic larvae spread through the entire herd within weeks. Embedding in the lining of the horses' digestive tracts, pregnant mares began miscarrying. The veterinary team on site had the equipment to intervene. They were under strict orders not to use it. The logic was brutal but deliberate. If these animals couldn't survive without human medical intervention, they would never function as a wild population. The filter had to run. Only the individuals whose immune systems could adapt would pass through it. For weeks, nobody knew which way it would go. And then something started happening that no zoo record had ever documented. The stallions began striking the ground, not grazing, not pawing out of frustration, striking repeatedly. With focused force at patches of surface ice 4 inches thick, they were locating subsurface water by sound and temperature gradient, then breaking through to reach it. This was not a learned behavior. It had never appeared in any of these animals during their entire captivity. It was older than that. It was instructions encoded so deep in the genome that 4 generations of concrete floors and automatic water dispensers hadn't erased a single line of it. The mares simultaneously began forming tight, circular formations around the young, the herd rotating slowly, taking turns facing the wind, distributing the exposure load across the group. No one taught them this. No one had to. The wild memory had never left. It had only been waiting for the conditions that would call it back. The horses that survived that first winter were fundamentally different animals from the ones that had stepped off the transport plane, and what they did to the desert over the following seasons was not visible to the human eye. It was happening underground. The digestive system of a wild Przewalski's horse is not gentle. The stomach acid is strong enough to strip the hard outer coating off seeds that had been lying dormant in the desert soil for up to 20 years, waiting for exactly this kind of chemical activation. After passing through a horse's gut, germination rates for those seeds increased by 300%. The math of what followed is difficult to visualize until you think about it this way. A single gram of horse manure contains an average of 7.4 viable seeds. Multiply that across a herd moving 15 kilometers a day through terrain where no seed dispersal mechanism had functioned for nearly 2 decades. The horses weren't just grazing. They were operating a biological seeding network at continental scale, completely automatically, at zero cost. By the second year, soil nitrogen levels across the monitored zones had risen 37%, not from fertilizer, from the gut bacteria of the horses, microorganisms that fix atmospheric nitrogen and deposit it directly into the soil profile with every passage. Then the dung beetles came back. They had been absent for 15 years. No manure, no beetles, no beetles, no deep burial of organic matter, no enrichment of the subsoil layer. The moment a consistent manure source returned to the landscape, the beetles reappeared, millions of them, and began doing what they had evolved to do, drilling organic material down into the earth, aerating the soil from below, creating channels that water could finally follow downward instead of evaporating off the hardened surface. Within 2 more seasons, 22 species of native plants that hadn't been recorded in the region for a generation began germinating from seeds that had outlasted everything. The drought, the dust storms, the years of dead ground, they came up in the microbasins left by hoofprints, in the disturbed edges of beetle tunnels, in the nutrient pockets left by decomposing manure. 43 species of insects followed, then the skylarks, then the rodents that fed on the insects, then the predators that fed on the rodents. Nobody planned this sequence. Nobody scheduled it. Nobody funded a single step of it after the initial release. The system had simply remembered what it was supposed to do and started doing it again the moment the one missing piece was returned. In August 2001, the gates of the Kalamali Nature Reserve opened for the last time. 27 horses walked out into 4,000 square kilometers of unfenced desert. No tracking crews followed them. No supply stations had been placed along any route. The reserve boundary was the last piece of human infrastructure these animals would ever need. The lead stallion, designated Hong by the research team, did something that stopped the monitoring scientists cold. Without hesitation, he turned the herd and walked them 30 kilometers in a straight line, directly to a water source that appeared on no military map. No geological survey. No satellite hydrology chart. A subsurface spring that human instruments had never detected. Hong had never been to this land before. His parents had never been to this land. And yet he walked to that water like he had the coordinates memorized. By droite de chance. The water table across the entire Kalamali region had stopped declining for the first time in a generation. Then it began rising. Now here is where the accounting gets interesting. Environmental economists who analyzed the Xinjiang herd's contribution began trying to put a dollar value on what a single Przewalski's horse actually does in a year. Not what it costs to maintain, because the maintenance cost at this point was essentially zero. What it produces, the numbers broke down like this. Soil structure restoration $12,000 per animal per year. Autonomous seed dispersal across the landscape $8,000. Groundwater retention through the hoof impact and vegetation mosaic system $15,000. Atmospheric carbon sequestration through biomass recovery $7,000. Biodiversity infrastructure, the insects, birds, and small mammals that return because the ecosystem now supports them $5,000. Total ecological output per horse per year $47,000. The current Xinjiang herd numbers 534 individuals. They are autonomously managing 26,700 hectares of former desert. The gross ecological surplus they generate annually for the national land balance is $25 million. The maintenance budget required to produce that output is zero. Compare that to the $47 billion spent on the Green Great Wall, the trees that drain the aquifers, the machinery that compressed the subsoil, the villages that had to be evacuated when the wells went dry. 2 decades of the most expensive land restoration program in human history, and the desert continued advancing. 11 zoo animals, and a decision to stop interfering, did what $47 billion could not. The scientific community that had publicly condemned the project had to quietly file those condemnation records away. The model spread. Kazakhstan launched its Golden Steppe Rewilding Corridor in 2024. Mongolia's Hustai National Park expanded its own Przewalski's program into new territory. China extended the Kalamali Reserve boundaries by an additional 350 kilometers. With a target of 2,500 horses by the year 2040, enough to sequester 43,000 tons of atmospheric carbon annually without a single carbon capture machine. Here is what this story actually is. Underneath the ecological data and the satellite images and the recovered water tables, the horses were never an act of charity. They were not saved because humans felt guilty. They were reintroduced because one researcher understood something that the entire engineering establishment had missed. The desert was not broken. It was incomplete. And the missing component was not a machine. It was not a budget. It was not an algorithm or an irrigation plan or a government initiative. It was an animal that had been doing the job perfectly for 40,000 years before we switched it off. Stop engineering. Start remembering, which raises a question worth sitting with. If a horse can restore a dying desert by simply being returned to the landscape it evolved in, what else have we switched off? What are the woolly mammoths doing to the Siberian permafrost right now in their absence? As the tundra thaws and releases carbon at a scale no treaty can address, what did the American bison herds do to the Great Plains soil for 10,000 years before we reduced them from 60 million animals to fewer than 1,000 in the span of a single human lifetime? The technology already exists. It has always existed. We just keep mistaking extinction for progress.